Episode 11 of Space Prison by Tom Godwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Space Prison, Episode 11. The first rays of sunrise were coming into the room, revealing fully the frail thinness of the pups, when there was a step outside and Julia's voice. "Father?" "Come in, Julia," he said, not moving. She entered, still a pale shadow of the reckless girl who had fought a unicorn, even though she was slowly regaining her normal health. She carried young Johnny in one arm, in her other hand his little bottle of milk. Johnny was hungry. There was never quite enough milk for him, but he was not crying. Ragnarok children did not cry. She saw the pups, and her eyes went wide. Prowlers! Baby prowlers! Where did you get them? He told her, and she went to them, to look at them and say, "If you and their father hadn't helped each other that day, they wouldn't be here, nor you, nor I, nor Johnny, none of us in this room." "They won't live out the day," he said. "They have to have milk, and there isn't any." She reached down to them, and they seemed to sense that she was someone different. They stirred, making tiny whimpering sounds, and tried to move their heads to nuzzle at her fingers. Compassion came to her face, like a soft light. "They're so young," she said. "So terribly young to have to die." She looked at Johnny and at the little bottle that held his too small morning ration of milk. "Johnny, Johnny," her words were almost a whisper. "You're hungry, but we can't let them die. And someday, for this, they will fight for your life." She sat on the bed and placed the pups in her lap beside Johnny. She lifted a little black head with gentle fingers, and a little pink mouth ceased whimpering as it found the nipple of Johnny's bottle. Johnny's gray eyes darkened with the storm of approaching protest. Then the other pup touched his hand, crying in its hunger, and the protest faded as surprise and something like sudden understanding came into his eyes. Julia withdrew the bottle from the first pup and transferred it to the second one. Its crying ceased, and Johnny leaned forward to touch it again, and the one beside it. He made his decision with an approving sound and leaned back against his mother's shoulder, patiently awaiting his own turn, and their presence accepted as though they had been born his brother and sister. The golden light of the new day shone on them, on his daughter and grandson and the prowler pups, and in it he saw the bright omen for the future. His own role was nearing its end, but he had seen the people of Ragnarok conquer their environment insofar as Big Winter would never let it be conquered. The last generation was being born, the generation that would meet the Gurns, and now they would have their final ally. Perhaps it would be Johnny who led them on that day, as the omens seemed to prophesy. He was the son of a line of leaders, born to a mother who had fought and killed a unicorn. He had gone hungry to share what little he had with the young of Ragnarok's most proud and savage species, and Fenrir and Segin would fight beside him on the day he led the forces of the Hell-world in the battle with the Gurns, who thought they were gods. Could the Gurns hope to have a leader to match? Part 4. John Humboldt, leader, stood on the wide stockade wall and watched the lowering sun touch the western horizon, far south of where it had set when he was a child. Big Summer was over, and now, in the year 200, they were already 3 years into Big Fall. The crags had been impassable with snow for 5 years, and the country at the north end of the plateau, where the iron had been found, had been buried under never-melting snow and growing glaciers for 20 years. There came the soft tinkling of ceramic bells as the herd of milk goats came down off the hills. 2 children were following, and 6 prowlers walked with them, to protect them from wild unicorns. There were not many of the goats. Each year the winters were longer, requiring the stocking of a larger supply of hay. The time would come when the summers would be so short and the winters so long that they could not keep goats at all. And by then, when big winter had closed in on them, the summer seasons would be too short for the growing of the orange corn. They would have nothing left but the hunting. They had, he knew, reached and passed the zenith of development of their environment. From a low of 49 men, women, and children in dark caves, they had risen to a town of 6,000. For a few years they had had a way of life that was almost a civilization, but the inevitable decline was already underway. The years of frozen sterility of big winter were coming, and no amount of determination or ingenuity could alter them. 6,000 would have to live by hunting, and 100 in the first big winter had found barely enough game. They would have to migrate in one of two different ways. They could go to the south as nomad hunters, or they could go to other, fairer worlds in ships they took from the Gurns. The choice was very easy to make, and they were almost ready. In the workshop at the farther edge of town, the hyperspace transmitter was nearing completion. The little smelter was waiting to receive the lathe and other iron and steel and turn them into the castings for the generator. Their weapons were ready, the mockers were trained, the prowlers were waiting. And in the massive corral beyond town, 40 half-tame unicorns trampled the ground and hated the world, wanting to kill something. They had learned to be afraid of Ragnarok men, but they would not be afraid to kill Gurns. The children with the goats reached the stockade and two of the prowlers. Fenrir and Segin turned to see him standing on the wall. He had made a little motion with his hand, and they came running, to leap up beside him on the 10-foot-high wall. "So, you've been checking up on how well the young ones guard the children?" he asked. Segin lolled out her tongue, and her white teeth grinned at him in answer. Fenrir, always the grimmer of the two, made a sound in his throat in reply. Prowlers developed something like a telepathic rapport with their masters, and could sense their thoughts and understand relatively complex instructions. Their intelligence was greater, and of a far more mature order, than that of the little mockers, but their vocal cords were not capable of making the sounds necessary for speech. He rested his hands on their shoulders, where their ebony fur was frosted with gray. Age had not yet affected their quick, flowing movement, but they were getting old. They were only a few weeks short of his own age. He could not remember when they had not been with him. Sometimes it seemed to him he could remember those hungry days when he and Fenrir and Segin shared together in his mother's lap, but it was probably only his imagination from having heard the story told so often. But he could remember for certain when he was learning to walk, and Fenrir and Segin, full grown then, walked tall and black beside him. He could remember playing with Segin's pups, and he could remember Segin watching over them all, sometimes giving her pups a bath and his face a washing with equal disregard for their and his protests. Above all, he could remember the times when he was almost grown, the wild, free days when he and Fenrir and Segin had roamed the mountains together. With a bow and a knife and two prowlers beside him, he had felt that there was nothing on Ragnarok that they could not conquer, that there was nothing in the universe they could not defy together. There was a flicker of black movement, and a young messenger prowler came running from the direction of the council hall, a speckle-faced mocker clinging to its back. It leaped up on the wall beside him, and the mocker, one that had been trained to remember and repeat messages verbatim, took a breath so deep that its cheeks bulged out. It spoke, in a quick rush like a child that is afraid it might forget some of the words. "Will you please come to the council hall to lead the discussion regarding the last preparations for the meeting with the Gurns? The transmitter is completed." The lathe was torn down the next day, and the smelter began to roar with its forced draft. Excitement and anticipation ran through the town like a fever. It would take perhaps 20 days to build the generator, working day and night so that not an hour of time would be lost,